Good morning, Capital Region and beyond, and welcome to the sixth in a series of webinars that were created last spring during a most unusual moment for the country and for the Capital Region, and that was the closure of our economy and our schools in the face of an unprecedented pandemic. The purpose of these webinars was to provide a forum for discussion and also to provide some information from expert panelists on various aspects of reopening the economy, reopening our schools, and facing down the pandemic. I'm happy to say that the sixth in our series today has a couple of panelists that I think you're all going to enjoy, and they will be introduced later in the session, and we will talk about the reopening of schools in our region, our challenges, where we've had successes, where we've had surprises. But I'd like to start today one by thanking our partner, the Times Union, for co-sponsoring this event with us, and also my two partners, Hugh Johnson and Susan Reese, who are the most senior investment professionals in our firm and are going to talk about the economy and the financial markets. And specifically, we're going to address the issue asked by many of our clients, which is, given the very fast snapback in the financial markets, are the financial markets disconnected from the economy? The undercurrent here is that many middle-class Americans and businesses are still struggling, and are the financial markets taking into account that undercurrent? I'm going to turn first to Hugh Johnson, who is a student of financial market history and never ceases to surprise us with his comparison to past historical events and his judgments on what we're going through at the moment always seem to be spot on. So Hugh, I'm going to ask you, is this bull market or this snapback in the market reflective in your view of what's really happening in the economy?
Yeah, that's a question, Dan. That's a great question, and it's a question I get asked almost every day. The only thing I can say, it certainly appears as though the markets are disconnected from the underlying economy when you see the financial markets doing what they're doing, and that there's still lots and lots of problems that confront the U.S. economy and, quite frankly, the global economy. I've been a student of financial market history. I look at all the cycles back to 1890. Keep in mind, everybody should remember that a cycle consists of three parts. It consists of a stock market cycle, which is followed by an economic cycle, which is followed in time by an interest rate cycle. And the most important or operative words that I mentioned there is followed by, because these things don't occur simultaneously. The stock market occurs, and again, it's followed by an economic cycle. If we take a look at the performance of the financial markets more recently, and I really think we're looking at all of 2020, but certainly back to the start of this rise in stock prices, I call it a bull market that started in late March. You see that the stock market not only rose, but you also see that the so-called bull market sectors, things like economically sensitive sectors such as consumer discretionary, technology, materials, industrial stocks, stocks that quite frankly don't do much unless we see positive signs that the economy is going to do, economy and earnings are going to go do well. They've been the best performers, in the so-called safe sectors. So utilities and consumer staples have been the worst sector, or the bottom of the rung. And, mid-cap stocks have outperformed. We see that quality spreads in the credit markets, the yield on a junk bond is getting close to the yield on a treasury, indicating that investors are willing to take a greater amount of risk, which they're only willing to do ordinarily, or historically, they've only been willing to do when they think prospects for the economy are getting better and better. So the message of the financial markets has been clearly very, very positive, despite what you see in the economic numbers. It's not hard to reason why the financial markets have performed well. We've rarely, and I would say almost never, seen this level of stimulus in our economy. We've never seen the Federal Reserve lean so aggressively towards less restraint. They started this with the interest rates, federal funds rate at 1.5 to 1.75%. It's now 0 to 25 basis points. The level of reserves in the financial system is extraordinary, 2.7 trillion. The level of commercial and industrial loans growing at a 23% pace, the long-term average being about 7%. The money supply expanding at a 21% pace, long-term average about 6%. You don't see this level of monetary stimulus except very seldom in our financial market history. And of course, the level of fiscal stimulus, spending by the federal government, has been also unprecedented. The deficit this year is going to be about $3.3 trillion. That's 3 times the size of the deficit last year. The deficits are going to go from 4.5% of gross domestic product. It's just a number, but are going to go up to 16%. And I think you get a sense of how stimulatory that could possibly be. And of course, as a result of that, we have positive liquidity conditions and leading indicators for the economy, indicators that tell us where the economy is going, not where it's been, have been rising for 4 successive months, telling us that we're, I hate to say it, on a roll, but we're headed towards an expanding economy. You're going to see that. You're going to see that in the third quarter. Economic numbers, GDP will be up at about a 25% pace after contracting at a 31.7% pace in the second quarter, which was, of course, dominated by the lockdown that we saw in March and April. So the economy is starting to expand, and that's really very good news. And so investors, essentially, the bottom line is investors saw this coming, and they started to buy stocks in March. They saw it coming for lots of good reasons. The reasons primarily being the level of stimulus that they saw. They knew that sooner or later that had to pay off in positive economic numbers, and it certainly has. We see employment. We've picked up. We've regained about 11 million of the 22 million jobs we lost in March and April. That's good news. And as I say, it will also show up in GDP numbers. More recently, now this is, of course, the part you have to ask questions about. More recently, the market's run into a little bit of trouble. Since the beginning of September, it's declined. Why? My view is that it's declined mostly because, look, we're up 63% since March. That's too far, too fast. We became overvalued. The upside potential in the market was through 2021 was just negative, minus 3%. Valuation was a problem. Professional investors, savvy investors saw that. And so we saw a decline in the market to levels that make a lot more sense. I think we may have further declines to levels, again, that make more sense or are cheaper. And it's going to set up prospects for better markets in the future. Keep in mind one thing, very important thing, that the stock market is rising. It's been rising for 6 months. The average duration of bull markets is 63 months. That indicates or implies that we have further to go. I think we have a lot further to go in this economic expansion, but there are going to be bumps in the road along the way. And if there's ever been a quarter when there might be big bumps, and of course, with the election being right in focus, this might be the quarter of some very big bumps. So positive news, I think that positive news is ongoing, but it's certainly understandable that you have everybody has lots of questions.
Yeah. So Hugh, you see what looks like almost perfection, but Susan, I talk to a lot of friends of mine that own small businesses, medium-sized businesses, restaurants, manufacturing, and I get a different view of the economy. I get people saying to me, my sales are still down 40%. If I didn't have PPP, I'd be out of business. I'm going to try to make it for another couple of quarters. Is the economy ignoring that news?
I think at the moment, you could say that the markets are ignoring that data. And if we look at the S&P since the beginning of the year, since Monday, the value index, the Russell 1000 value, is actually down 13% as of Monday. You contrast that with the Russell 1000 growth as of Monday, and it's up 21%. So that's a 34% differential between the growth and the value sectors of the market. So this is not a full run of the markets all moving up simultaneously. It is specific sectors, specifically growth, heavily in tech, heavily in the 5 large names. So I think that's indicative of the underlying fiscal and monetary support that allows those stocks to continue to grow with the markets. But the rest of the S&P 500 does reflect what's going on in the economy. You mentioned the unemployment numbers. I just want to say that consumer confidence is actually up again, which I think is surprising to most people. And I see Hugh nodding as well. I think that surprises us that consumer confidence continues to climb while we look at, when the unemployment $300 a week runs out in October, sometime in October, what's going to happen with that?
Yeah, that's, excuse me, go ahead, Susan. I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's really important.
It
Yeah,
isn't.
I mentioned that we've regained 10 million of the 22 million jobs we've lost, but everybody should realize that each month it gets less and less. We regain a lot of jobs 4 months ago, a little bit less 3 months ago, a little bit less 2 months ago. This week, we're going to see the September numbers, and they're going to show about a gain of 800,000. And the reason for that is the reason we're just sort of, yes, we're expanding, but we're expanding at a slower and slower pace. That includes retail sales, and that's because there's no additional stimulus coming out of Washington. You've got 13.5 million people. They need help. They need that stimulus, and if they don't get that stimulus, consumer spending, retail sales are going to get slower and slower and slower, and all those companies that Dan's talking about are going to have more and more and increasingly more trouble. So you just can't go to sleep on this, and I think that's what you're getting at, and I think that's what Dan's getting at. These companies cannot survive forever without some help or stimulus.
Susan, what would you say to a client who asked you, I've got some cash on the sideline, should I invest now? And how should I invest? How do we respond to that?
I think there's a couple points. The first one is I get the question a lot about timing, about waiting for a pullback. And I really think since June, we've been waiting for a double dip or a pullback. I think it's clear now that I don't think there's going to be a double dip recession. I think that the economy is resilient, the markets are resilient. There is clearly support at the moment. I know Congress can't come up with a deal, but they will, and something will be resolved to continue to support the unemployment numbers, because you need the economy to do well in order for the markets to do well, and for the average person to have a lifestyle to support their family. So I think what I would say to people who are sitting on cash are two things. One, make sure you have enough cash to ride through volatility. Volatility is actually very normal. It's uncomfortable. Nobody likes it, but the markets are volatile. That's a part of what being invested is. So as long as you're invested for the longer term and looking down the road past the pandemic, I think that's the first point. If you're looking for particular areas, we like infrastructure. If you're going to be in fixed income, we like total return in terms of fixed income, because you don't want to reach for yields and high credit. If you're looking at equities, we still like dividend strategies. They are undervalued relative to growth. If you do have the ability to use hedging strategies and option overlays or hedge strategies, I think those are worthy. Regionally, we don't like the UK. I think we've lost Brexit and all of this. That's coming up. So I would be underweight the UK and still look at some developed international companies that have good cash flow. So there are places to look if you want to invest some cash.
Right. Hugh, last word on that?
I can't disagree. Susan is so good at this and so good at structuring portfolios, and there's no way I can improve upon it. The only thing I would add to it is I'd say don't lose sight of the fact that if we go down further, it's an opportunity to buy. Remember, that to me is going to be within the context, again, looking at cycles back to 1890, within the context of an ongoing bull market. So I think this is going to be a positive environment. But as Susan says, she's absolutely right. It's going to be full of volatility.
All right. So I think the point you're both making ultimately is that investment planning, especially during times of severe volatility, successful investment planning requires a plan without emotion, some resolve to ride through volatility. If you have dry powder, take advantage of dips. But the notion that I can time the market and buy on dips and sell on peaks, I think has been proven over the years not to be true. So I think that I think we've had some really good information. I would say that even in the best of times, forecasting the performance of the financial markets and the economy is difficult. In times like this, totally impossible. So again, the real advice here is have a plan and stick to it. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Hugh. We're now going to turn to the next couple of panelists who are going to discuss restarting our schools. And to introduce those panelists, I'm thrilled to have Casey Seiler, the editor of the Times-Union, back as our moderator. And Casey, if you would take over and introduce our panelists, I would appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks as well to Hugh and Susan. In times of great volatility, there's a lot to be said for clarity and lucidity of diagnosis, without a doubt. So, yes, and now for our panel discussion, which touches on what is going on campuses at New York's colleges and universities. Why are we taking up this subject and what is ostensibly a business webinar? Well, of course, beyond the importance that the higher education sector presents for the larger state economy, there is also the fact that college and university campuses are, in and of themselves, microcultures, micro-societies, and micro-economies, connected, of course, to the larger culture, society, economy, but to a certain extent circumscribed. And for a look at that, I am very happy to be joined by our panelists, and they are Dr. David Holtgrave, who has served as the Dean of the School of Public Health at UAlbany since March 2018. David is also a SUNY Empire Innovation Professor and a SUNY Distinguished Professor. He came to UAlbany after 13 years at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore, where he was appointed to hold the inaugural Health, Behavior, and Society Professorship. David has also held joint appointments in the Johns Hopkins Schools of Medicine and Nursing. And Siena College President Chris Gibson, the 12th leader of the Loudonville campus, and the first president who did not come from the Franciscan order. Instead, Gibson came to the post after a military career that included 4 combat tours in Iraq and saw him rise to the rank of colonel. He also served 3 terms in Congress as a Republican, ending in 2016. In addition to a bachelor's degree in history from Siena, he holds 2 masters and a Ph.D. in government from Cornell University. He is the author, most recently, of Rally Point: 5 Tasks to Unite the Country and Revitalize the American Dream. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that my son is a Siena student. Go Saints. And with that, I would point out to the audience before posing the first question that if you have any questions over the course of this debate, please send them our way in the chat below. We will be monitoring those and we'll have time at the end of the session to address them. So with that, David, I think I would direct the first question to you. You've taken part in these webinars now since the beginning, back in the bad old days of the spring. Could you provide kind of an overview of where we are in the state overall and on higher education campuses in particular, especially UAlbany?
Great, I'd be happy to. Thank you very much, Casey. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to get a chance to join with everyone on the panel again for the Back to Business series. These are great discussions and I find myself learning more and more every time I participate. So thank you. Sure, I can say a little bit about the epidemiology of where we're at kind of in the US and then move quickly to New York and then to colleges and universities. As of Monday of this week, there were over 33 million COVID cases worldwide, and now we're over, sadly, 1 million deaths worldwide from COVID-19. In the US, as of the same date this week, there were over 7.1 million cases of COVID, and sadly now we're at over 205,000 deaths, which is enough to fill the gigantic University of Michigan football stadium twice over, or roughly the size of a medium US city. Also in 2020, COVID-19 will very likely be the 3rd leading cause of death, only behind cancer and heart disease. We still have a few dozen COVID-19 cases per hour in the US, and sadly, some of those cases seem to be on the uptick again, with over 20 states reporting increases of 10% or more in the past week, and very few states indicating decreases. The health disparities in the pandemic, as evidenced in the US, are truly terrible, with Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities very disproportionately impacted. In New York State, there have been over 455,000 cases out of about 10.5 million tests that have been performed. Early in the pandemic in the state, the test positivity rate for New York City was well over 50%, and it neared 50% for the state as a whole. Now in New York State, it's hovered at around 1% for several weeks, and that's important. The New York State COVID-19 Early Warning Monitoring System dashboard is immensely important because it lets us see these numbers in real time. And for areas in the day with rising positivity rates or other metrics, we can note those as the reopening continues. So for instance, as of Monday of this week, the percent positivity rate was highest in the Mid-Hudson and Western regions at 1.5 and 1.3% on a rolling 7-day average. Gross new hospitalizations per 100,000 population was higher in these two regions and in New York City. And the governor announced this week that about 25% of new cases are occurring in just 10 zip codes, thereby requiring a pretty intensive response in those very local areas. And this includes sending 200 rapid testing machines to Brooklyn, Orange County, Rockland County, and the Southern Tier. So overall, New York State's doing a very good job of controlling COVID-19, but I'd compare the situation to having pressure on a wound. You can control the bleeding with constant vigilance and attention, but the moment you let up, that bleeding can start again. In the US, colleges and universities have faced challenges to reopening, especially to on-campus courses. According to the New York Times, as of September 25th, a survey of more than 1,600 US colleges and universities, and this includes all public institutions and all private institutions that compete in NCAA sports, indicated that there had been over 130,000 cases and 70 deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. Over 35 colleges have had at least 1,000 cases during the pandemic, and over 230 have reported more than 100 cases, again, per the New York Times website tracking COVID at US colleges and universities. Just late yesterday, CDC issued a report finding that COVID-19 cases, quote unquote, surged nationally among 18 to 22-year-olds between August 2nd and September 5th. So either in advance of or in response to these COVID challenges at campuses, a large number of institutions of higher learning have launched massive testing and other prevention efforts. For instance, at the University of Illinois, there's been over 40,000 students who are tested twice per week. And at University of Illinois and other universities like Notre Dame, they've identified enough cases that they had to pause and go to all online learning, typically for a couple of weeks, but have then been able to reopen after they've made some mid-course adjustments. Here at SUNY, SUNY has launched a website, suny.edu/COVID-19 tracker that helps keep track of all of the current efforts and situation at the 64 SUNY campuses. And so too at the University at Albany, we've launched a dashboard which summarizes the tests and cases identified to date. The number of cases is given separately for students living on campus. As of last night, that was 35. Students living off campus but taking classes on campus, that was about 20. And students living off campus but taking remote classes entirely, and that was about 66 last night. And this is on a 14-day rolling average. The number of cases reported for faculty and staff at UAlbany, thankfully, is still 0. And UAlbany has really taken a number of steps to try and foster the safety of faculty, students, and staff. Before returning to campus, students needed to submit a negative test and quarantine themselves. Also, there's an online symptom screener to be completed every time someone comes on campus. And if that screener indicates an issue, the person is reported for the appropriate medical care and further diagnostic testing. And also, UAlbany is doing saliva testing in a pooled format for asymptomatic persons. And this is available for everyone who studies or works at UAlbany. And further, UAlbany is now implementing wastewater testing as well. So this is a very multi-layered testing strategy in addition to the promotion of physical distancing, hand sanitization, mask wearing, avoidance of large gatherings, and so on. And I would say, as is the case for New York State overall, these efforts are important and they're impactful, but also require constant vigilance and attention. And the last thing I'll say and stop, Casey, and turn it back to you, is that one important final note I would make is that New York State, I think, is importantly focused on metrics, dashboards, and threshold levels at which to take additional or different steps in the reopening process, including at universities. And I think that's in very stark and beneficial contrast to the nation as a whole, where we still don't have one comprehensive overall national COVID strategy. So recently, some colleagues and I have been writing about the issue of what would a national strategy really look like for COVID-19, and could we draw on other infectious disease areas like HIV or influenza or others to kind of jumpstart the compilation of such a true national strategy. So I think, though, it's important to remember that without the national strategy, we don't have as big of an impact as we could have otherwise. So that's something we've been thinking a lot about and writing some about of recent days. So let me stop there. Thank you again for letting me participate, and I look forward to the further discussion. So Casey, back to you.
Well, thanks a lot. That's an excellent comprehensive look that takes you, as it were, from the balcony all the way to the dance floor. And for somebody who is right in the middle of it, Chris Gibson, we're about 6 weeks into the return of students to campus at Siena. What's the report from your campus? How have things gone, and sort of what's the update?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be with everyone. Really appreciate David's very extensive and I think thorough laydown of preparation, execution, and status. And, I would echo his comments, both in terms of what Siena's been doing, but also, quite frankly, we could have used more help. And what I mean by that is not only that strategy, but then the resourcing of that strategy as it comes all the way through, particularly for a private institution that doesn't have the benefit. We, the people, through our representatives, we appropriated $25 billion with a B for testing. Private schools like Siena, not in receipt of any of that. Now we're thankful to have access to New York State's. That's a good thing. But I mean, that's an example where not having a strategy that looks all the way across really impacts private institutions. I mean, we've got 21 active cases on campus right now, none of which are faculty and staff. These are students, none of which are symptomatic. They're all asymptomatic, which means we found them, which is what you really need to do. I mean, look, we know the way this pathogen has a rate and impacts on young folks, but no one wants to have that case where a student with pre-existing health conditions or a faculty and staff who has more vulnerabilities to adverse outcomes ends up contracting this pathogen. So, this is why you have to hunt it. You have to go after it. And so, for us, we use a similar approach. This wastewater has been a great surveillance tool. I mean, we know the first 3 draws of our surveillance of the wastewater, the RNA in our wastewater, was actually utterly negative. So we know we started from a very strong position. And the minute we started seeing some indicators, that's when we targeted our testing towards it. And we have found asymptomatic positive cases. And we're going to stay after this. We did a bunch of testing yesterday, and we're soon to expand out. I mean, one of the challenges we've had is our lab, which we're really pleased with. Tremendous lab, but they're in the process of getting approval for saliva testing, and we think that's in the offing here imminently. That's going to help us. That's going to help extend our reach. But for now, we're using the gold standard, the PCR gold standard for our testing. So yeah, I mean, I have no delusions about this. We have planned our way through this, and it's going to be a slog between now and November. And we are leaning in, and I appreciate my entire team and the efforts that they've been doing towards that end.
So my brother and my sister-in-law both teach at a small private college in Pennsylvania. I remember talking to my brother in July, right after his campus decided to go all virtual. There are some students on campus because they can't be at home, but the campus is largely pretty much shut down for the fall semester. And he said at that time, at the prospect of opening up and bringing students back, he said, if there's one thing we know about college students, they love following rules, somewhat sarcastically. So it was predictable that students were perhaps not always going to follow every protocol that that health policy experts and college leaders had planned for them. And this is sort of a jump ball for both of you. what is something that surprised you about what has happened on your campuses over the course of the last 6 weeks, 2 months or so? And what is something that you feared might have happened that did not come to pass?
You want to start, President Gibson?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, let me just say that, first of all, I do appreciate the compliance on campus here has been very strong, not 100%. And, as we entered into the semester, I mean, we very thoughtfully went about our planning and came to the conclusion, not an epiphany, but I think one that's important, is we're in a relationship, we're conveying an educational program, the students are in receipt of that. And so everyone had responsibilities, duties. So we wanted students to read the pledge that we gave to them about their behavior, to contemplate it. And then after thinking through it and envisioning themselves complying with it, then affirm it, sign the pledge and send it back. And likewise, for the faculty and staff, I mean, we had duties and responsibilities along the academic track and the residential life track. And so, that's what we have been working on. And, so when we have had infractions, we've had to enforce that. And, I mean, that's without any kind of emotion to it. I mean, we love everybody. It doesn't mean we don't love our students, but we have to follow through on what we said we were going to do. So, that has been an unfolding here. As far as what feared and not materialized and surprised, look, the pre-COVID data on students' levels of anxiety and depression certainly got my attention. When I was studying for this application to be president, I mean, I looked at that. And, it's enough. My wife's in this field. She's a licensed clinical social worker. I've seen it in post-traumatic stress for combat troopers. And, this was a major issue area of my legislative work in the U.S. Congress. So concerned about the state of mental health of my students. I must tell you, overall, I've been really impressed. That fear has not materialized. I mean, knock on wood right now because we're not done. But I have seen the students really take a high level of maturity in dealing with this very challenging situation. So I'm very pleased with that. In terms of surprise, I have to say that our interactions, the contact tracing has gone better than I thought. When we planned this and actually did an exercise, we did a tabletop exercise. We were concerned enough after the tabletop exercise to set up a second exercise, and that was actually with the Department of Health. They have been very responsive. I just want to say both the Albany County Department of Health and the New York State Department of Health. We are on the phone with them every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And that contact tracing has been central to what we're doing here. I mentioned that we found these asymptomatic cases. And of course, the process is you isolate the positives and then you contact trace and you quarantine. Quarantining, let's say it, it's a drag, but it's really necessary. It's part of the health of the community that if you were in close proximity, and this is defined by the processes from the Department of Health, then we quarantine. And I've also been impressed the way the students have been understanding about that, because that's critical to this overall process of really attenuating the spread. And so I have to say that I wondered how that was going to go, because, back in March, as this whole thing was actually unfolding, we had a case here of a faculty member. Again, we have no faculty and staff now that have gone through a case, but back then we did, and the whole thing was just getting up and running, and the contact tracing was very labored and you might say drawn out, and that has not been the case here this fall. I'm very thankful for that.
David, I just want to take a pause to remind those listening, if they have any questions, to please put them in the chat, and we'll take time for those toward the end of the session. But David, for you, any surprises or fears that were scotched, as it were?
Yeah, no, thanks, Casey. I think in terms of surprises, I'd go back to earlier in my career, I worked at CDC for several years, and a common phrase that we used was, what do we think and what do we know? And it was always when you're tackling an important challenge to sort out what's the data tell you, and where do you maybe not have data, but you have some experience from public health that's relevant. And I think if in some ways what surprised me about COVID-19 so far is just how prescient that phrase is. What do we think and what do we know? I mean, every day we're learning still something new about the virus, how it works, how it's most easily transmitted, what the impacts are, short-term and long-term, what different treatments work best. And, you know, I don't think that I'm alone in that surprise. Dr. Tony Fauci at NIH has kind of brought this up before as well, too, that it's a very unusual virus. So for some people, there's very little impact, and some people, it's literally a deadly virus. And usually we don't see such an extremely broad range of inputs or effects, I should say, that we're seeing here. And so that is something that's, I think, really important. And also, I'm a little worried that we still have some hard lessons to go. We're only a few months into this, and we don't know exactly what all the long-term consequences are for different patients who may have experienced this. We don't know exactly the long-term level of prevalence and consequences of, say, myocarditis among young athletes and what that will turn out to be in the long run. So we're still learning, and I'm a little surprised by how much we're continuing to learn. As far as fears that haven't happened, very similar to, I think, what President Gibson said. I personally, in COVID-19, am terrified of the word complacency. And Dr. Sanjay Gupta on CNN often talks about looking for loopholes, and that it's important not to look for loopholes, but rather look for ways that you can be supportive and going along with things like wearing masks and physical distancing. And as I said earlier, we just can't let our guard down. This virus is so transmissible and so easy to transmit that the efforts we have in place now make an enormous difference, but we have to keep them up. And I think that New Yorkers have done a really good job, both locally on campuses, but also in New York State overall, of making sure that we don't let complacency take over. And in some areas, in some other states like Florida, where now there's a wide opening of all restaurants, bars, and so on in Florida, with no local ability of jurisdictions to control mask use, even though there's a lot of community spread. That's exactly the kind of thing that worries me. So I've been really pleased to see that that by and large has not been occurring in New York, and people are continuing to support from students, faculty, community members, business leaders, and people all across the state, keeping up our efforts in this regard.
Chris, I guess that's a good segue to ask you, are you very glad that you don't run a private college in Florida, for example, where the larger society is opening up? Siena is a suburban campus. It's close to Troy, close to Albany. But are you glad that you are in a state that is continuing with the sort of phased reopening that we've seen over the past 4 months or so?
Well, I don't know how you could deny that. I mean, take a look at Notre Dame was mentioned earlier. David talked about Notre Dame, also a private institution, one that I hold in high regard. I mean, they had initial struggles and had to go remote for 2 weeks. And what I told our students is we started in a strong position for a couple reasons. One is the region was in a strong position. If you opened up in Notre Dame when the region was really having some challenges, that's going to impact. I mean, any entity, particularly a college, is going to be in large measure influenced by the region that you're in. So, and then the other piece is for all our students who came in who were outside, New York, as we looked at late August, I mean, our prevalence was less than 1%. The positivity, I think, got down like to 0.7 or 0.8. And so New York was, and, eventually our vision for Siena is to be a national college. We're not that today. Almost half of our students are within an hour's drive of Siena, and about 85 to 90% are actually within 2 to 3 hours drive. So at this point, that's a blessing because we were in that strong position. For students who came from outside of New York or from overseas, we did the mandatory quarantining, the testing that went along with it. And so when you pair that and, with the wastewater, we knew we started from a strong position. So now, had we been in, a place like Florida or another place that was really on the uptick, I mean, I I think you would have really started with 2 strikes at the plate against a amazing all-star pitcher. It would have been a very tough situation. So we are blessed by that and thankful for it.
Our education reporter, Rachel Silverstein, who has been, of course, covering the process at every local campus, including Siena, she and I were talking about a story she did a couple of weeks ago about a student from out of state who was on lockdown in her dorm room at Siena. And I remember thinking, it's a 2-week process. This kid's going to crack at about day 9, day 10. And in fact, I was very surprised to see sort of the resiliency of that student, of course, with help from support on campus. But so one kind of last question from me for both of you. As noted at the top, colleges and universities both are and are not businesses. But what are some of the lessons that the corporate world can learn as they consider their own phased reopenings from the experiences of what you've seen on campuses? Are there sort of portable lessons from the realm of higher education to the realm of business?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would just say that the reality that we find ourselves in is we're constantly mitigating risk. I mean, we're not going to take it to zero. We know this. I mean, we're in this reality. And so part of that means adjusting the overarching, paradigm for your institution. So, for us, for example, to mitigate risk, we still have, we look at our faculty and staff, even though we are in-person residential experience, what that means is about 60% of our courses are in-person, about 40% remote. And then with regard to the staff, at any given day, maybe half, oftentimes less than that, of the staff is physically present on campus. So I think a challenge is really the execution of the mission faithfully to it, and the supervision of a campus that is in part remote. And so, that's a challenge. I mean, I think we're doing fine with it. But I think that's a reality that a lot of our businesses are also going through, is how do you go about doing that? How do you get the most? How do you get the most for your bottom line? How do you help a flourishing life? How do you deal with the perceptions maybe of inequities? That if you're, say, a challenge you may have is choosing who's going to be on campus and who's going to be remote. And is there a perception that you chose one because they didn't have children or something like that? I mean, there are all kinds of challenges that are leadership challenges. And I think it's part of the reality that we're in, and we are sorting we're sorting it through day by day. And I'm sure that the business owners out there are having similar challenges.
And I think I would first of all, agree everything that President Gibson said. And I would just sort of highlight 3 things for myself. I think one is the importance of data and dashboards. And as I mentioned earlier, at UAlbany, we're constantly keeping up with our dashboard if you just Google UAlbany COVID and dashboard, it'll take you right to it. And the numbers, the most recent numbers are always there. And I think whether it's for the university, for SUNY, for the New York State, for Albany County, or the nation, it's incredibly important to have these kinds of dashboards, because unless you have the data, you don't know where your mid-course corrections need to be, what they need to be focused on, and so on. And I think it's in the day in, day out dealing with this, it's easy to lose sight of that. So I think sort of constructing your own dashboard with relevant data, I think is useful. The second thing, just quickly to mention, I think, is that we're all learning as we go that community transmission means that we're sort of all in this together, whether it's students living on campus, off campus, businesses, restaurants, bars, finance firms, newspapers, no matter what the organization that we're talking about. The virus doesn't sort of go into a shopping mall and say, I'm going to take one kind of store or another. It sort of looks for opportunities to infect people. And I think increasingly, we're finding that it's important to have your own organization working extremely well. But even if you had perfection in all of the PPE and protective measures and testing and so on, people who work at your organization don't live at work. They go home, they live in communities, organizations interact with each other. And I think increasingly we have to think about kind of community-wide ways to address COVID-19. It's important to think about one organization at a time or one business at a time, but coalitions, I think, will make a difference. And then the last thing I would just say is that it's important to think about as we reopen again, what do we want to keep in terms of lessons and what do we want to get rid of? So as we reopen again, some things like on-campus teaching, laboratory experiences, experiential learning, those are so important things to get back to. We're already doing some of that, but to increasingly get back to it over time as quickly as you can. But also asking ourselves, were there things in how we did business that might have been better? So for instance, we've in school where I'm the dean, I would dare say we've seen an increase in number of scholarly papers that have been written, important research projects that have been done incredibly quickly and published in important places very quickly. And also we're seeing, I think, that people who are doing research are participating in a lot more conferences and so on now, because there's so many things that you can participate in the US and New York and around the globe, because you don't have to travel there. We're all making our conferences online. And at first that seemed like a detriment, but in some ways it's also a benefit. And I know that we're able to participate in conversations that we couldn't necessarily have maybe afforded the travel or the time to go to. So as we reopen, I think thinking about what do we want to jettison, but also what do we want to keep are important questions too.
Casey, I just wanted to ask a question to David. First of all, I agree with everything he just said, including dashboard and the other things that he's learned. So one of the things that we've been very keen and dialed in on is trying to understand patterns. And that's why we're constantly on the phone with DOH. And they've been very responsive because, I do have some communal bathrooms and we're cleaning them twice a day, high touch. And I keep asking, are we seeing any? And that's not, it appears that our transmission has occurred among people either through close contact, because I'm not seeing any patterns like in a freshman dorm in touch areas. Now we are fastidiously cleaning them, but I'm wondering, are you seeing anything like that? It appears our transmission that we've had has been person to person and not from touching.
Thank you. It's such an important question. And, I think one reason that the dashboard for UAlbany is broken out the way it is by students living on campus and studying there, students living off campus but studying on campus, and those who are studying and living off campus, as well as faculty and staff, that kind of gives you a sense, I think, of whether or not you're seeing sort of some pattern. And as I mentioned earlier, it was interesting to me that kind of the number of cases, and again, I'd refer to the dashboard for the latest numbers, but the number of cases on campus versus off campus are kind of similar sorts of numbers. And so you're not seeing a big pattern there, as you were saying, President Gibson. I think earlier on, as students came back, there was widely reported issues with some large gatherings, and that may have led to an early set of a number of cases that I think has been addressed very appropriately. And it's important, I think, on the dashboard, not only to look at kind of that static 2-week period, but a rolling period, because we saw maybe some of the impact of early large-scale gatherings earlier on. And then as the 2-week periods reset, you kind of lose sight of that earlier piece. But if you keep looking at the rolling average, it gives you a sense of where we're headed. So I think my comment, I guess I've been mentioning UAlbany, but just yesterday, CDC came out with this MMWR early that I mentioned on colleges and universities. And I thought what was interesting there was they looked at patterns and clusters, and they didn't exactly name, but sort of named a major public university where there had been a number of clusters that occurred. And the CDC MMWR really focused a lot on large-scale social gatherings such as parties, and really focused on dormitories or communal living experiences as areas of important needed attention. And so the CDC emphasis really struck me in those two areas from yesterday. So those are just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to thank you both for your expertise and your assessments. And I'll hand it back to Dan Nolan and open it up to Susan and to Hugh as well. I think we have a couple of questions from participants. So Dan, over to you. Oh, Dan, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry.
There you are.
So Casey, let me just second your comments. Thank President Gibson and Dean Holtgrave. Informative, interesting. I think we learned a lot. Let me just say there are many questions. Some of them have been answered during the discussion. I obviously won't ask those again. I won't get to all of the questions. So if your question isn't asked, I apologize, but we have limited time. And there are questions both for Dean Holtgrave and Chris Gibson on the experience with schools, but also for Hugh and Susan on the investment side. Let's deal with Dean Holtgrave and President Gibson first, since we're in that mode. This is not directed to either of you, so one of you specifically, so either can answer, I'm sorry. What is the trickle-down effect? I would assume there is a rise in community college attendance and education or transfers because of the costs. Why stay on campus if there is no traditional on-campus experience?
Yeah,
David?
thanks. A couple things is number one is we're doing the best we can to deliver our in-person Franciscan-oriented educational program, and to the best we can, a flourishing life, a residential experience. Obviously very challenging, but we believe that, as Aristotle said, humans are social beings. We want to be in the presence of others. What we have to do now is we have to be physically distant, but not socially distant. And that's the thing that's worried me about the construction of communications. And actually in my messaging, I've said, we're physically distancing, not socially distancing, because I think we really, more than ever, we need each other. So look, Siena College, we candidly, we've got the highest enrollment we've ever had in the 83 years of Siena College. And, we're working really hard for our folks. It's not an easy period, but like I said, I think every day we're going to keep working and try to keep getting better. I think this goes to David's point too. Is humans, I think that's part of life, is that we're always striving to get better. And so when it comes to the coronavirus, it's the very same thing. So, we are a niche in the market, the kind of education. Part of what attracted me to come back to Siena, and I was at an institution right before this, and a very nationally renowned, highly ranked institution, which I still love very much, of course, to this day. But what's different about Siena is we're focused on whole person development, absolutely intellectual development, but also physical development, moral, ethical development, religious development, and spiritual development. That may not be for everyone, but in America, there is a market for that. So we're bullish on our future. We think, I say the world needs more saints. And I say that in part because of my experience in the US House of Representatives. I had some really good days, and if I had it all do again, I'm sure I'd do it again, but I'd be less than candid if I didn't tell you I had more frustrating days than good days. And so that left me really wondering, what's my calling? And I believe my calling is right here, is to help grow the next generation of leaders. They're out there. And I think that our country, we're going to have a comeback. People are worried about the level of civility in our country, this cohesion, the fabric of our nation. And I think that what we have to do is really invest in young folks. And I think they're really going to achieve and surpass our expectations. And so that'd be my response. Folks can always choose a community college. They always have had that option, but I think there'll be some, and I believe quite a few, that will be interested in what Siena is offering. And we're excited to bring them here to campus.
David, thoughts?
Well, I just would add, I agree with everything that President Gibson said, and just maybe underscore that, we really are in a temporary situation. I think there's still a great belief in not only online, but also in-person experiential learning. In fact, our School of Public Health's tagline is defining experiences in public health. And what we really offer is students working part of their time at Department of Health or other places to get real frontline experiences. And so I think in the planning, we keep, and I'm sure this is true for many of the businesses participating today, keep planning pivot points of what do we need to do right now? What will the spring look like, and so on. And always in those planning exercises is thinking about how do we get back to campus our full array of experiences as quickly as we possibly can, so that we're back to that experiential learning in every way. And in the meantime, using these online experiences to the best we possibly can. And I would say too, I think in terms of enrollment and retention numbers overall, those are actually quite good. I think this is a time when many people are sort of taking stock of where we're at in society and saying it's an important time to get that certificate or that degree that I was looking at doing before. But of course, the number of students who are living in dorms is less than it was before. But overall, the numbers of students who want to continue their education I think is really strong, and I think actually could be even stronger in the future. But the mix of the students is changing, and also the residential experience is changing a bit. But hopefully we come on the other side of this as quickly as possible and continue to plan for that, but also pivot points along the way too, as we need to make adjustments.
Thanks, David. I'm going to give the last 2 minutes to Susan and Hugh on a financial markets question, and it's two-part question. The first for Susan, the second for Hugh. And you have 1 minute each so that we can keep to our promised ending time of 10. Susan, the first part is, you mentioned that you don't anticipate another market crash. What makes you believe that?
I'm sorry, you said anticipate
Another market crash.
I would say a crash is a really it's a harsh word. Do I expect volatility? Absolutely. Do I think there's going to be pullbacks of a potential of 10 or 15%, or possibly a correction that might be brief like we saw in March? I think it's possible. Do I think it's likely? I don't think a 20% pullback is likely. So what makes me say that is because there's enough cash in the sidelines, and there's a lot of people waiting for that opportunity to go in when there is a pullback. So I think when we see it, that there will be investors who will have cash ready to invest, and that will become a backstop for a major correction.
Thank you. And Hugh, this is going to be really hard. 1 minute to say, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I do agree, because there would be, let's not call it a sharp correction or a crash or whatever you want to call it. For that to occur, I think we'd have to see the end of the cycle, and we'd have to see signs that we're going to have a recession. And I don't think that's going to be the outcome. Susan said something earlier today, which was really important. And that is, she doesn't see the recession coming, or that we're not going to have a rollback of the reopenings to the level we saw in March and April. And this kind of gets to what David was talking about, and that's this, is that although there's going to be some rollbacks, in other words, there's obviously a lot of businesses that are, rolling back a little bit of what we're doing. We've actually gone through a process of learning as we've been moving along. And because we've been learning, there's a lot of things that are happening. So we do get a little bit of an increase in the number of cases. At the same time, when you look at the deaths and hospitalizations, those numbers are getting a little bit better. So we apparently, and David will have to clarify this, we apparently are learning something. And I think because we're learning something, we're not going to get the rollbacks of the reopenings that we were talking about. We're not going to see March and April. And if we're not going to see March and April, we're not going to see the so-called crash or a sharp decline in stock prices. Correction? Yes, maybe, but sharp decline, crash, no.
Okay, thank you. First, thanks to all of you who tuned in. I hope you found it enjoyable and informative. Stay tuned for more webinars as we continue to gain experience on this pandemic and how to control it. Thanks to our partner, the Times Union, and to Casey Seiler for his expert monitoring of the debate. You had a little easier time today than Chris Wallace had last evening, I will say. And thanks
So
to our
true,
panel.
so true.
Thank you, Dean Holtgrave, President Gibson, Hugh Johnson, Susan Reese. I hope that all of you found this to be informative. So thanks once again. We're signing off for now, but stay tuned. We'll be back.
Thank you.